Welcome to the final big picture information note project presentation for the summer 2010 version of Educational Research. During this presentation, I will try to address specifically those elements included in parts 11 and 12 of the course outcomes that will affect your the way you study for reading quiz number 4, as well as how you proceed with the course project. The general topics that are addressed in parts 11 and 12 include qualitative research in general, and specifically some of the different designs that are part of the qualitative research category, the sampling issues and techniques in qualitative research, specifically how action research as a form of qualitative research could be very useful for practicing teachers, and as part of action research, what some of the differences are between practical action research and participatory action research. Now, it's important to remember that in the request for proposal that defines the course project, you are being asked to describe the way in which you might solve or at least investigate problems that have been defined by the Institute of Educational Sciences, and the way in which you define these problems, or the specific problem, needs to be both quantitative through quasi-experimental and experimental, and qualitative, because you are being asked to define a mixed method approach to help you support hypotheses associated with the problem. Now, again, remember that in the course project, the problem that you are dealing with is associated with instructional strategies for learners who possess different learning styles. So no matter what your problem is, it is going to be addressing this particular topic. And again, you should read through carefully parts 1 and 2 of the request for proposal if you want more information about this. Now, what's indicated in different colored font in this topic are some of the important variables that you are going to be addressing within the design of a research investigation. So let me just spend just a moment talking about variables, particularly variables associated with doing research that involves human subjects. I'll tell you what, there is no more obvious example of the differences that exist between human beings, or the variables, than when you go to the beach. And again, variables are anything that any differences that exist between humans, and when we're talking about human subjects research, or any differences that already exist, or differences that you might be able to observe and somehow control or manipulate. So variables are all about differences. And by the way, I've stared at this picture for a while, and I still can't find where Waldo is in this picture. Very confusing. You have been presented with information about the different types of variables that are included in research investigations that involve human subjects. But it's important to note that independent variables are those variables that you are either manipulating or selecting. And this is important because many of you have submitted proposals and you have not identified learning styles as an independent variable, when in fact, in most of the designs, the learning styles are in fact a difference between your groups, and that difference isn't something you manipulated, but it is something that you selected. And so just to remind you that in many cases, the independent variables in your studies involve different instructional strategies that you might try, as well as the selection of groups of learners who possess specific learning styles. Perhaps the most common dependent measure that is addressed in most of the studies for this project involve learning or achievement as measured through existing instruments. These might include items from the Virginia Standards of Learning Test or items that are part of existing instructional programs, say a second grade math program or language arts program or something like that. Also remember that other dependent measures might include attitudes about learning the specific material or learning the outcomes associated with the specific material. Dependent variables then are those variables whose change depends on the independent variable. At least you assume that it does. And finally, the last type of variable that we have been addressing are those extraneous variables that might influence and affect the dependent variable, but they are not your independent variable, and so you want to try to take measures to control those variables as much as you possibly can. And as many of you probably know, if you're doing human subjects research, particularly in typical classroom settings, there are many variables that could influence achievement if that's your dependent variable, or attitudes if that's your dependent variable. But those variables may not be part of your design. They may not be an independent variable. In this picture, you can see gender, you can see children who are wearing glasses or not glasses, you can see ethnicity, you can assume that these kids are being brought up in households where parental involvement is very different. There are different teachers depicted in this picture, and so the teacher that is the main shepherd throughout any typical day would be a variable that might influence achievement or attitudes. And so it's important in experimental designs to control for these variables as best as you possibly can. And you make a deal with yourself when you design for controlling for these variables, because you may end up designing a situation that does not necessarily reflect how things typically operate within a classroom. And that sort of brings us to the value and the approach of qualitative research designs. Remember that in the request for proposal, you are asked to design a mixed method approach to investigating the problems that you have defined. In a mixed method approach, you will be describing a quasi-experimental or experimental approach, as well as a qualitative approach to investigating your identified variables. In the next part 2 of this presentation, I will be presenting very briefly those characteristics of qualitative research that you need to consider, or that you should consider, when you are working on your complete proposal for the course project.